The night they drove Willa Crenshaw out of Harland Bluff, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the sky had turned the color of old pewter. She stood at the edge of the road with nothing but a flour sack of belongings and a library book she had never returned, a worn copy of the Farmer's Almanac from 1934. While behind her, the windows of the town hall glowed yellow, and the voices of people she had known her entire life rose in agreement that she was no longer welcome among them. She was 16 years old. It was November of 1935, and the worst winter in the history of the Blue Ridge Mountains was exactly 11 days away. Willa had tried to warn them. That was her crime. For 3 weeks, she had been telling anyone who would listen that the signs were wrong, that the mild autumn they were celebrating was a trick, that the barometric readings she had been tracking in a little notebook, the one her father had taught her to keep before the mine collapse took him, pointed to something catastrophic. She had observed the behavior of the woolly bear caterpillars, whose black bands were wider than she had ever seen. She had noted the unusual thickness of corn husks at the Dawson farm. She had measured the height of the yellow jacket nests, tracked the early departure of migratory birds, and cross-referenced everything against the data tables in the back of the almanac. Nobody wanted to hear it. Not from a girl. Not from an orphan. And certainly not from the daughter of Thomas Crenshaw, who people still whispered about as a man who had filled his child's head with nonsense about weather patterns and soil composition instead of teaching her to be useful. But Willa kept talking. She told the widow Patterson that her root cellar wasn't deep enough. She told Mr. Hargrove at the general store that he should double his order of kerosene. She told the school teacher, Miss Adler, that the children should be sent home with extra provisions. Then she made the mistake of telling Alderman Buford Sims. Buford Sims owned half the businesses in Harland Bluff and sat on the town council like it was a throne carved from the mountain itself. He had already sold off a large portion of the town's emergency grain reserves to a buyer in Roanoke at a handsome profit, because everything pointed to a mild winter. When a 16-year-old orphan girl stood up at a town meeting and declared that a devastating winter was coming and that the town was dangerously unprepared, Buford saw not a warning, but a threat to his reputation and his profit margin. Within 2 days, he had convinced enough people that Willa was a liar and a troublemaker. He said she was trying to cause a panic. He said she had stolen supplies from the storeroom behind the church, where she slept on a cot that the congregation grudgingly provided. The supplies, 2 jars of preserved beans and a sack of dried corn, had actually been given to her by the pastor's wife, but the pastor's wife said nothing when the accusation was made. She looked at her hands. Everyone looked at their hands. The vote to expel Willa from the charity rolls and revoke her shelter was unanimous. If you want to find out how a 16-year-old girl, cast out into the cold with nothing, built something that would one day save the very people who abandoned her, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Willa Crenshaw created in the mountains above Harland Bluff didn't just save lives. It changed the way an entire region thought about survival. Willa walked north. She walked because her father had once told her that the northern face of Cobb Mountain had a series of natural limestone hollows that stayed warmer than the outside air, even in deep winter. He had explored them as a young man and told her stories about finding ferns growing inside one of them in January, fed by a thin trickle of water from an underground spring that never froze. She walked for 2 days, sleeping the first night curled inside a hollow oak, shivering so hard her teeth cracked against each other. She ate the last of a biscuit she had wrapped in cloth and tucked into her flour sack. By the second morning, her fingers were blue at the tips, and she could no longer feel her feet properly. She knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had studied cold exposure in books, that she was approaching the early stages of hypothermia. It was midday on the second day when she found the hollows. They were exactly as her father had described, a series of deep limestone cavities carved into the northern face of the mountain, shielded from the wind by a natural rock overhang that jutted out like the brim of a hat. The largest hollow was roughly 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling that arched overhead in a smooth dome. The walls were dry, and at the very back, just as her father had promised, a thin stream of water seeped from a crack in the rock and pooled in a natural basin before draining away through a gap in the floor. The air inside was cold, but not bitter. Willa pressed her palm against the limestone wall and felt a faint warmth, the deep, steady warmth of the earth itself held in the rock like a memory. She collapsed against the back wall of the hollow and wept for the first time since they had sent her away. She wept for her father. She wept for the mother who had died of typhoid when Willa was 9. She wept for the pastor's wife who had looked at her hands. Then she stopped crying, wiped her face with her sleeve, and began to think. The hollow was shelter, but it was not a home. The water source was a gift, but it was not food. Willa understood, because Thomas Crenshaw had raised a girl who understood things, that survival required more than hiding. It required building. Over the next 3 days, while the temperature continued to drop, Willa worked with a ferocity that would have stunned anyone watching. She gathered pine boughs and dead leaves by the armful, packing them against the walls and floor of the hollow for insulation. She hauled flat stones from a nearby creek bed and fitted them together to form a fire pit near the entrance, angling it carefully so the smoke would catch the natural updraft along the rock overhang and be carried away without filling the cave. She discovered that the overhang created a chimney effect. The warm air rising from her fire drew in fresh air from below, creating a natural ventilation system that her father would have recognized and admired. She found a stand of dead birch trees 50 yards downhill and broke off branches for fuel, stacking them deep inside the hollow where they would stay dry. She gathered handfuls of dried moss and strips of birch bark for tinder, storing them in a crevice where moisture could not reach. She collected creek stones and heated them in her fire, then placed them along the walls of her sleeping area, where they radiated warmth for hours after the flames died down. These were the lessons of a girl who had read about frontier survival when other children were reading fairy tales, and now those lessons were the only thing standing between her and death. On the 4th day, the storm arrived. It came exactly when Willa had predicted, a wall of Arctic air that slammed into the Blue Ridge like a fist. The temperature plummeted to 4 degrees below zero in a single night. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling in drifts that buried fences and collapsed the roofs of chicken coops all the way down in Harland Bluff. Willa survived. Barely. She rationed her fire, slept wrapped in pine boughs in the single blanket she had brought, and melted snow for water when the spring trickle slowed to a drip. She ate bark tea and the inner cambium of pine trees, a trick she had read about in a book on frontier survival that Miss Adler had let her borrow 2 years before. She lost weight. Her ribs became visible, but she did not die. And during those long, dark days, huddled in the limestone hollow while the world outside turned white and deadly, Willa Crenshaw began to plan. She had noticed something about the hollow during the worst of the cold. Even when the outside air was lethal, the temperature inside the deepest part of the cave held steady around 40 degrees. The limestone was acting as thermal mass, absorbing what little heat there was and releasing it slowly, the way a stone hearth stays warm long after the fire goes out. The underground spring, too, emerged at a constant temperature, around 52 degrees, regardless of what was happening on the surface. Willa's father had taught her the basics of how caves maintain temperature. He had talked about French farmers who grew mushrooms in limestone caves and about the root cellars of New England, where vegetables stayed fresh through winter buried deep in the earth. But what Willa began to imagine was something more ambitious than a root cellar. She imagined a vault, not a vault for money or gold, but a vault for life, an underground growing chamber where the earth's own warmth, combined with careful construction, could sustain plants through even the harshest winter. She had read about the Willa, an underground greenhouse design used by farmers in the high Andes of Bolivia, where the growing pit was dug deep enough into the earth to capture geothermal warmth, with an angled roof of translucent material to admit sunlight. She had also read about the forcing houses of Victorian England, where gardeners grew pineapples in the dead of winter, using decomposing manure for heat and glass for light. What Willa proposed to build was a hybrid, a growing vault carved into the limestone hillside, extending outward from the natural hollow, with a south-facing entrance cut at an angle to capture maximum winter sunlight. The limestone walls would store heat. The underground spring would provide water. Decomposing leaf litter and animal manure, once she could acquire it, would generate additional warmth through the biological heat of composting. It was an insane idea for a 16-year-old girl alone on a mountain with no tools, no money, and no help. She began anyway. Through the rest of that first winter, Willa did two things. She survived, and she dug. Using a flat piece of shale she had shaped against the rock into a crude chisel, she began carving into the soft limestone at the back of the hollow, angling downward and to the south. The work was agonizing and slow, measured in inches per day, not feet. Her hands blistered, cracked, bled, and blistered again until thick calluses formed over calluses. Her shoulders ached so deeply that some mornings she could not lift her arms above her head until she had worked the joints loose by the fire. But she kept at it. She worked for hours each day, scooping out the soft stone and carrying it in armloads to the entrance, where she used it to build up retaining walls. She learned that the limestone varied in hardness. Some layers crumbled almost like chalk, while others required patient chipping. She learned to read the grain of the stone the way her father had read the grain of coal seams, following the softer veins to make her progress faster. She carved a rough arch at the entrance to her new passage, remembering something she had read about how arches distribute weight, and though it was clumsy work, it held. When the worst of the winter broke in late February, Willa ventured down the mountain for the first time in 3 months. She looked like a ghost, gaunt, weathered, her clothes hanging loose. She did not go to Harland Bluff. Instead, she walked 12 miles in the other direction, to the tiny settlement of Cade's Mill, where nobody knew her name or her story. There she found Elspeth Mackey. Elspeth was 73 years old, a former schoolteacher who had been living alone on a small homestead since her husband's death in 1919. She was sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and had a library of over 200 books packed into a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. When Willa appeared at her door, half-starved and asking if she could trade labor for food, Elspeth studied her for a long moment and then said, "You look like you've been arguing with God and haven't decided who won yet. Come in and eat something." That meal, cornbread, bean soup, and a cup of real coffee, was the first proper food Willa had eaten in nearly 4 months. She ate slowly because her stomach had shrunk, and while she ate, She talked. She told Elspeth everything about her father, about the weather predictions, about Buford Sims, about the hollow, about the vault she was trying to build. Elspeth listened without interrupting. When Willa finished, the old woman stood up, walked to her bookshelf, and pulled down a thick volume on agricultural engineering. She set it on the table between them. "My late husband was a mining engineer," Elspeth said. "He spent 30 years figuring out how to dig into mountains without them falling on his head. I think you and I have some reading to do." Over the next several months, Willa split her time between Elspeth's cabin and the mountain hollow. Elspeth supplied knowledge, tools, seeds, and something Willa had not had since her father died. Someone who believed that her ideas were not just possible, but important. From her husband's engineering books, Willa learned about load-bearing arches, drainage grades, and ventilation shafts. From Elspeth's own extensive knowledge of botany, she learned about which plants could thrive in low-light conditions, which root vegetables could tolerate the cool temperatures of an underground vault, and how to build a composting system that would generate steady heat without toxic fumes. By the fall of 1936, Willa had carved out a growing vault that measured 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet deep at its lowest point. The south-facing entrance was fitted with a wooden frame over which she stretched oiled muslin. Not as good as glass, but it admitted enough light for cold, hardy greens to grow. Deep composting beds lined both walls, filled with layers of forest debris, chicken manure from Elspeth's small flock, and rich mountain soil. The underground spring was channeled through a simple clay pipe irrigation system that kept the beds moist without flooding. The first crops she planted were kale, turnips, winter lettuce, and spinach. She also planted garlic, which Elspeth told her would overwinter in the ground and emerge vigorous in spring. When winter came again in 1936, Willa did not merely survive. She harvested. In the dead of January, with snow piled 3 feet deep on the mountainside, she pulled crisp green kale and fat white turnips from the earth inside her vault, where the temperature held steady at 45 degrees. She wept again, but this time from something she had never felt before, the fierce private joy of having built something real from nothing. Word spread the way it does in mountain communities, slowly, through whispers and disbelief. A trapper named Galt, who ran his lines along Cobb Mountain, stumbled upon Willa's hollow in the winter of 1937 and found her hanging bundles of kale to dry from the ceiling of the outer cave. He told people in Cade's Mill, who told people in the settlements beyond, and by the spring of that year, strangers were making the climb up the mountain just to see the girl who grew food underground. Willa did not turn anyone away. She showed them everything: the vault, the composting system, the irrigation channels, the careful angling of the entrance for maximum light. She gave away seedlings and instructions. She drew diagrams in the margins of newspapers. Elspeth, who had become something between a grandmother and a partner to Willa, watched this with quiet satisfaction. "Your father raised you to share what you know," she told Willa one evening. "That's rarer than you think." By 1938, Willa had expanded the vault system to include 3 interconnected chambers, each dedicated to different crops. The deepest chamber, which stayed warmest, was used for starting seedlings in late winter. The middle chamber held root vegetables and cold, hardy greens. The outermost chamber, which received the most light, was used for herbs and medicinal plants: chamomile, echinacea, yarrow, and comfrey, that Willa had learned to cultivate from a book on Appalachian folk medicine that Elspeth had given her. She also began building terraced growing beds on the south-facing slope above the vault entrance. using the limestone rubble from her excavation work as retaining walls. These terraces captured and held heat during the day, extending the growing season by weeks in spring and fall. By her 3rd year on the mountain, Willa was producing more food than she could eat alone, and she had begun to carry the surplus down to Cade's mill, where she traded it for supplies she could not produce herself: cloth, nails, lamp oil, salt. She asked for nothing from Harland Bluff. She did not speak of the town. When people in Cade's mill asked where she came from, she said simply that she was from the mountains, and they accepted this the way mountain people accept most things, with a nod and no further questions. But Harland Bluff heard about her anyway. Word traveled along the ridgelines and through the valleys, the way smoke travels, thin and almost invisible, but unmistakable if you knew what you were smelling. The winter of 1935 to 36 had been devastating for the town, just as Willa had predicted. 3 elderly residents had died of exposure. A family of 5 nearly perished when their chimney collapsed under the weight of ice, and they could not keep their cabin warm. The emergency grain stores that Buford Sims had sold off were desperately needed and desperately absent. Livestock perished by the dozen. Cattle froze standing in fields. Chickens died in their coops. And the few goats that survived did so only because their owners brought them indoors. The church roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated ice and snow. People survived, but they survived diminished, and the memory of the girl who had tried to warn them sat in the town's collective conscience like a stone in a shoe, impossible to ignore, painful to acknowledge. Buford Sims, for his part, never acknowledged what he had done. He rebuilt. He continued to sit on the council. He continued to profit. But there were people in Harland Bluff who remembered and who felt the weight of their silence. Elspeth Mackey died in the spring of 1940, peacefully in her sleep with a book open on her chest. She was 78 years old. She left everything to Willa: the cabin, the land, the books, and a small amount of money she had saved from her teaching years. In a letter she had written and placed inside the cover of her husband's engineering manual, she wrote, "You came to my door looking like the end of the world, and you turned out to be the beginning of something. Use what I've left to keep building. The world needs more people who dig." Willa grieved deeply but did not stop working. She moved into Elspeth's cabin, which gave her a proper base of operations, and continued to expand her growing vault on the mountain above. By 1941, she had developed a system that could produce fresh vegetables 10 months out of the year, even at an elevation of 3,000 feet. It was in the summer of 1941 that she met Daniel Rowe, a young carpenter from Cade's mill, who had come up the mountain to repair a section of her terrace wall that had shifted during spring rains. Daniel was quiet, capable, and possessed of a quality that Willa had learned to recognize and value. He listened before he spoke. He looked at her vault system, not with skepticism or amazement, but with the practical eye of someone who wanted to understand how things worked, so he could help make them work better. They were married in the fall of 1942, in a small ceremony at Elspeth's cabin attended by the people of Cade's mill, who had become Willa's community. Daniel built a proper greenhouse frame over the vault entrance, using glass salvaged from a demolished factory in Roanoke, and the improvement in light transmission transformed Willa's growing capability dramatically. Then came the winter of 1943. It was not as cold as the winter of 1935, but it was longer and wetter, and it came after a summer of drought that had devastated crops across the region. By January of 1944, food shortages had reached crisis levels in the mountain communities. The war had drawn away young men and resources. Government aid was slow to arrive. In Harland Bluff, people were hungry. Willa learned about the situation from a traveling minister who passed through Cade's mill. He described children in Harland Bluff eating boiled acorns. He described old women splitting a single potato between 3 families. He described Buford Sims, now in his 60s, sitting in his store surrounded by goods he was selling at prices nobody could afford. Daniel watched his wife's face as she listened. He knew what she was going to do before she said it. "They sent me away to die," Willa said quietly. "They did," Daniel agreed. "I'm going to bring them food," she said. Daniel nodded. He began loading the wagon. Willa Crenshaw arrived in Harland Bluff on a frozen February morning with a wagon loaded with winter kale, turnips, dried beans, preserved tomatoes, and sacks of cornmeal she had ground herself. She drove the wagon straight down the main street and stopped in front of the church, the same church that had given her a cot and then taken it away. People came out of their houses slowly, as if approaching a ghost. Many of them recognized her. Some could not look her in the eye. The pastor's wife, now elderly and frail, stood in the doorway of the church and wept openly. Willa said nothing about the past. She did not make a speech. She did not demand an apology. She simply began unloading food and handing it to whoever reached for it. It was Buford Sims who finally spoke. He came out of his store and stood across the street, watching. The man who had orchestrated her exile looked diminished, thinner, grayer, his authority hollowed out by years and hunger. He stood there for a long time. Then he crossed the street, took off his hat, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong, and people suffered for it, and I have no right to ask anything of you." Willa looked at him. People who were there later said her expression held no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. It held something harder to name, something like the look of a person who has moved so far beyond a wound that returning to it feels like visiting a place they once lived but no longer recognize. "Eat something, Mr. Sims," she said. "We can talk about the rest later." But there was a rest, and it mattered. Over the following years, Willa did not simply feed Harland Bluff through one crisis. She taught them. She returned to the town repeatedly, bringing not just food, but knowledge. She taught families how to build their own underground growing vaults, scaled to their property and needs. She taught them about composting, about thermal mass, about the winter-growing varieties of greens that could keep a family nourished when the snow was deep and the roads were impassable. She taught them because her father had taught her, and because Elspeth had shown her that knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. By 1950, there were over 30 underground growing vaults scattered across the communities surrounding Cobb Mountain, all built using Willa's methods, and many built with her direct help. The region, which had been one of the most food insecure in Appalachia, became something remarkable. A network of families who could feed themselves through any winter, no matter how harsh. People came from as far away as eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina to learn her methods, and Willa turned none of them away. She had developed a simplified design that a single family could build in a summer, a smaller vault, perhaps 12 feet by 8, but effective enough to keep a household in greens and root vegetables from November through March. Willa and Daniel raised 4 children on the mountain, 2 girls and 2 boys, all of whom grew up with dirt under their fingernails and books on their nightstands, understanding the earth and what it could provide when treated with knowledge and respect. The eldest daughter, Clara, showed her mother's same fierce curiosity from a young age, and Willa made certain she had every opportunity that she herself had been denied. Clara earned a degree in agricultural science from Virginia Tech, the first person from Cades Mill ever to attend a university, and later wrote a widely cited paper on subterranean growing systems that referenced her mother's work extensively. The second daughter, Ruth, became a teacher. The older son, Thomas, named for his grandfather, became a carpenter like his father. The youngest, James, stayed on the mountain and took over the management of the vault system, expanding it further and experimenting with new varieties of cold weather crops that his mother had always wanted to try. The Farmer's Almanac from 1934, the library book Willa had never returned, sat on a shelf in her cabin for the rest of her life, its pages soft and brown with age, its spine cracked from 1,000 openings. She never did return it. She considered it the most important thing she had ever stolen. Willa Crenshaw Rowe died on March 14, 1997, at the age of 78, in the cabin that Elspeth Mackey had left her. She died in early spring, when the first green shoots were pushing up through the soil in the terraced beds above the vault. Daniel had passed 3 years before her. Her children and 11 grandchildren were present. At her funeral, the pastor of the Cades Mill Church read a passage that Willa had chosen herself, not from the Bible, but from the notebook her father had given her when she was 10 years old. In his careful handwriting, Thomas Crenshaw had written on the first page, "Watch the world closely, Willa. It will tell you everything you need to know, if you have the patience to listen. The underground vault on Cobb Mountain still exists. It has been expanded several times and is now maintained by a local agricultural cooperative. Every winter, it produces greens and root vegetables that are distributed to families in need across 3 counties. What do you carry inside you that the world has told you is worthless? What knowledge, what instinct, what quiet voice has been dismissed by people who were too comfortable to listen? What have you observed that others refuse to see? Not because you were wrong, but because your being right was inconvenient for someone with more power than you? Willa Crenshaw was not special because she could predict the weather or grow kale underground. She was special because she refused to let the world's rejection become her own. She took everything they threw at her, the accusations, the exile, the cold, the hunger, the silence of people who knew better but said nothing, and she composted it. She turned it into something that grew. She transformed the raw material of injustice into nourishment, not just for herself, but for the very community that had discarded her. That is not a skill reserved for a girl in the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1935. That is a human capacity. It lives in you the same way it lived in her, waiting for you to stop believing the people who said it wasn't there. Every person who has ever been told they were too much, too different, too stubborn, too strange, every person who has been punished for seeing what others refused to see, carries inside them the same potential that Willa carried up that mountain on a November night with nothing but a flour sack and a stolen book. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most important thing you can build is the thing everyone told you was impossible. And sometimes the people who cast you out are the very ones who will need what you've grown.